Okay, so thank you for having me again. I know I was here about 9 months ago and I gave a very long talk on, can't even remember now. It was best practices for code and like proving your code works. That's what I was talking about last time. So this talk today is about tech interviews, and there's a bit of a story behind it because it's something that's built up over a few years, this feeling about tech interviews, and recently it's come to a head, which I'll explain in a moment. I had a bit of I haven't settled on a title for this talk yet, but we're going to go with today, bad tech interviews and how to improve them. So a little bit about me. I'm Rob. I currently reside in Aylesbury, where I remotely work for a company based in London. Over the years, I've been a developer, a manager, and an architect, and right now I am back to being a manager. I've coded in PHP, Node, Deno, Rust, .NET, loads of other stuff. On the side, my open source, I maintain a JSON Web Token library in PHP called Really Simple JWT. It's now just on version 4, which was released just after Christmas, and has had about 250,000 downloads, which I'm quite proud about, actually. That's quite good. I now have a son who can be pictured there, and he was behaving while in the snow. Joel has that all to come. And I also have 2 cats. 2 cats and a son is a bit of a nightmare, but really, really fun. So let's get started with a little story. Some of you who may remember me from my last talk or who know me reasonably well will know that last year I worked at Eurostar. And I was there for about 18 months. And at the start, this time last year, everything was going really well. Eurostar, super successful company, turnover about £1 billion a year. And I was a solutions architect for them. And I was just getting settled into a job, getting to know the teams, getting to know their vast and complex architecture. And then COVID struck. And almost overnight, Eurostar went from turning over about £30 million a week to about £500,000 a week, which you can imagine for a large train company with lots of overheads was pretty much catastrophic. Now, the initial response to that was that I went on furlough, but after a couple of months, there were some projects defined which were like must have. So I was asked to come back in and work on those projects as a TypeScript developer. So I went from solution architect to TypeScript developer. Now, as the year progressed and we continued with the work, it became clearer and clearer that the picture for Eurostar wasn't getting any brighter. So eventually I decided it's probably best that I start looking for a new job because there would be the risk of redundancy in 2021. And I've been a developer for about 15 support. I need to get stuck in and just do it. And it was, to be honest, not the nicest experience. But one of the really strange conversations I had while I was at Eurostar was with a colleague, and we were talking about what we should do, whether we should stay or whether we should look for something else. And I told my colleague and friend that I was going to look for a new job and move on. And my colleague said something really, really, I felt was quite bizarre to me. He said he didn't want to look for a new job because he hated the interview process so much. He just dreaded it. He couldn't cope with going through it again. He'd worked hard to get this job at Eurostar, and the idea of having to go and do another set of interviews just filled him with dread. And I thought this was a very strange reaction, given that Eurostar was completely on its knees and basically bankrupt and could go bust in the next couple of months if you read the papers. And at the time, we knew it was in a lot of trouble. So it just felt like the logical decision. But then when you think about it, the tech interview process can be pretty wouldn't want to leave Eurostar unless he absolutely had to, i.e. Anyway, I did my round of interviews, and as usual, it was a general pain. It's full of like bad tests. This is one of the tests I got sent. It says basically, can you do this? You can do this exercise in 30 to 60 minutes. Now, the exercise would actually involve you to do quite a lot of things. So first of all, there's the idea of domain warm-up. So you'd have to warm up and understand the domain of the problem you're trying to solve. Then you have to spin up an environment. And then the test was like, call an API, get a token, call another API, get some data, process the data. And then like to add a bit of flair and to show you what you're doing, you'd have to write some tests, maybe run some CI, do some documentation, create a GitHub Actions pipeline, all those other things to complete the test, right? And that's not going to take 36 minutes. That's half a day wasted, maybe a day wasted to do it properly. And you get loads of these tests nowadays for tech interviews where you have to do a test and it said just spend a couple of hours, and it's always like build an application, connect to an API, build an API, do all these fancy things that take ages. And you just feel like, well, you know, why do I have to do this test to do something that's kind of like simple and obvious? You know, anyone can connect to an API, to, you know, then be told possibly, oh, well, you didn't pass the test, so goodbye, thanks for wasting half a day or a day, right? And that doesn't feel great. Then there's the subject of feedback. And one of my old colleagues, a chap called Jacob, went and did an interview recently because he had to leave Eurostar as well, sadly. And he did their test, and he wrote the tests and he did everything he thought was right. And then they gave him this feedback, and it reads, the guys have had a look and feel like the effort put in by Jacob was pretty minimal here. They saw lots of problems with the code and comments on how it should be done right, but no examples of any of that being executed. It seems like he's got other things to spend his time on, unfortunately. So it's a pass from us. So they've made an assumption about Jacob's performance, saying that he must have other things to spend his time on, like a life maybe, or work, or seeing his family, or, you know, just doing all the things that a normal person does. And he gets horrible feedback like this, even though he's done their test. And there's this just general feeling in the tech industry that like the interview process is really quite awful at times. And there's lots of examples. I've only picked out a couple here, but there's loads and loads of examples. And I've known this for years because I've been through this experience on numerous occasions. For every time I go through a cycle of getting a job, I have to go through this awful process. And I'm sure some of you have been through it as well. And I just feel after 15 years, I'm like, surely it must be getting better, but it doesn't. It's always the same cycle. Do a test, jump through all these hoops, and maybe you'll get a job, but who knows? Maybe you'll just waste your time. So it gets me thinking about like, how do we improve this process? Like, how do we get better at it? And I think a lot of it has to do with the people who are doing these interviews and defining these tests and what have you, getting a better understanding of what they're trying to do and trying to achieve, and having better values and better ideas behind those interviews and tests. So I put this talk together to try and go through that and express a few ideas which I think will help, right? Not only help the company find better candidates, but make it a more empathetic and a more enjoyable process for the developers. It's never going to be a perfect process. The interview process is always going to be a bit painful because, you know, to some degree, you are always going to be judged to a greater or lesser extent, but we can make it as nice and pleasant as we possibly can. So I've put together a collection of advice and we'll get started. So the first bit of advice to remember is you are not Google, right? The vast majority of people or software developers working at the vast majority of companies are not doing it at Google. They're not doing it at any other big tech firm. So just because, and this doesn't actually just apply to the interview process, this applies across the board. The point here is just because Google does something and gets famous for it doesn't mean that you need to do it or apply it to your situation, because your situation is entirely different to that of Google. And we see, you know, on lots of websites like Dev2, all things like the what I call the algorithm obsession. We have these interviews based around algorithms, and everyone thinks that developers have to know all the algorithms. And it's because companies like big tech companies like Google, who are working on some very hard and very technical and often mathematical problems, are looking at algorithms, and algorithms are important to companies like Google, but they're not necessarily important to your company. So you need to think about what is important. And if you don't believe me that like your company isn't Google, I'll just give you a couple of things to think about. There's a great book by Scott Galloway called The Four, which you should read, which is about Facebook, Google, Amazon, and Apple. And it sort of highlights what sort of outliers they are in relation to every other company that exists on the planet almost. But it applies generally to big tech. One thing to be aware of is most companies that you will work for, they will turn over about 50 to 200,000 pounds per employee per year. The big tech companies, so Google, Facebook, and even companies like Spotify and Netflix, who are famous in the tech circles and get all the press about how you should do everything, they're earning 10 to 20 times that per employee. So their resources are incredible, and they can do things entirely differently. So when you're thinking about doing your interview process and creating your tests, just put it in perspective and think about who you are, and don't necessarily just look at what Google or Spotify or anyone else is doing and copy that, because it might not really apply to what you're doing. And this is the key part to this. This is the real, like, where this actually begins to make sense. For most companies, for your average company and for your average software development team, it is more, people are more important than skills. So people over skills is something to remember. And what that means is, it doesn't mean that skills aren't important. Of course, technical skills are important. And if you're hiring a PHP developer or JavaScript developer, it is important that they understand PHP or JavaScript. But in most companies, and even quite big ones, in the last like 4 or 5 years, I've worked at quite like large companies, but nothing like a big tech company. But even in those large companies with dev teams of 40 or 50 people, the developers in those teams have to be developers who can wear many hats and get involved in many different things at any one time. They're not like sat in a cubicle focusing on one algorithm or one thing. They're often having to work on numbers of different things over the course of a sprint or over the course of a week. And they have to be good communicators. They have to have good soft skills. They have to be able to mentor junior developers. They have to have empathy for their colleagues and help their colleagues solve problems. And those problems are a great range of things. So more often than not, what you want from a candidate is a good person with good soft skills, empathy, good mentor, great communication, things like that. That's often much more important to you than technical skills. So again, when you're interviewing and when you're setting up tests, don't necessarily focus on technical skills, because they're not necessarily the most important thing that you're looking for. The next thing to talk about is the objectivity myth. So there's an idea that you can somehow create an interview process or a technical test that will split the good from the bad, the good developers, the technically knowledgeable developers from the bad developers. And that just isn't really the case. You can't. No interview process and no technical test will give you a perfect picture of the candidate who is being assessed. It's impossible. You'll not have all the information you need to make a perfect decision. So don't think that you can objectively solve this problem. You can't. There's going to be a lot of subjectivity in it. it's not to say that you can't build a process that works quite well, but it's never going to work 100% of the time, and it's never going to be like objective, because often it's situational. It depends on the candidate. There's lots of things involved. It's an unobjective, entirely subjective process. So don't kid yourself that you've written a test or something and they're going to do the test, and if they pass the test, they're a good developer, and if they don't pass the test, they're a bad developer. It just doesn't work like that. And this leads on to my next point. When you're doing tests, like, you're not doing tests, and really you don't even want to use the word test. A code assessment is a better term, and in many respects what you're doing is you're validating the candidate. You're not testing them. And this might seem like an odd differentiation to make, but it's an important one. What you're doing is, when you give a developer a code assessment of some kind or any other form of assessment, you're just trying to validate their skills. You're trying to validate where they are on the scale of developers, whether they're a junior or a mid or a senior. And you're not really aiming to filter on this test or assessment as such. You shouldn't really be filtering on the assessment, because you might have a candidate who is on many levels a great candidate. They're a great communicator, they care a lot, they've got empathy, they're a good mentor. Maybe they haven't got perfect technical skills, right? But you have to remember, it's easy to teach technical skills it's much harder to teach the soft skills. If someone's lacking in technical skills, you can teach that. If they're lacking in some of the softer skills like empathy and what have you, that's quite difficult to teach. That you're going to struggle there. So don't base things on a test. Make it an assessment and do it as a form of validation. I like to do it when I run interviews, and I should have mentioned at the start, really, I've done both sides. I've been an interviewer and I've been interviewed. I like to make the assessment part of a wider technical interview. So a developer does the assessment and they come to the technical interview, and you talk about the assessment with them to get a fuller picture of what they were trying to do with the assessment. You're not just doing what a lot of organizations do, which is get the test result in, look at the test, go, oh, I don't like what they've done here, reject, which isn't going to lead you down a path of necessarily finding good developers. Don't waste time. And what I mean by this is don't waste developers' time. Don't think you have some right to a candidate's time. Okay, they shouldn't have to give you a weekend to prove that they're a great developer or a good developer. You have no right to that time. And have some empathy. Lots of developers have very different life setups. They might have a big family, they might have caring, they might be a carer, they might have to care for someone, they might have other responsibilities, which means they don't have huge amounts of time to do like vastly complex developer tests. So just bear that in mind. You might be missing out on some good candidates because you're asking for too much time, or your expectation is too great. So just be aware of that, and don't try and take up too much of a developer's time, because their time is precious. So this is an important and secondary part to that, is keep it simple. Always keep it simple, particularly with the assessment. And the reason for this is you don't actually have to ask someone to do a very complex test for them to tell you a lot about their capability, right? So if you have a simple test that looks at user data, like we have on the screen here, like you could just say filter the data, or map the data, or merge the data with a small bit of other data, right? Do some simple things with data, and you can learn a lot from a developer about it. So you can learn about principles. Do they understand things like single responsibility? Do they write tests? Do they use CI? Have they created a CI pipeline? Have they written some documentation? Do they understand code design? You can understand, or you can learn all these things and get an impression of that from a relatively simple task or assessment, especially one that you then go on and discuss with them. You can get some details on what their thinking was when they were doing the assessment, rather than, again, just taking the test in, looking at it, saying no, and saying goodbye. And this is helped if you define clear expectations, right? So you create an assessment or any number of tasks you want to put a developer through, but you have clearly well-defined expectations for that. So like a developer will provide a good answer for all the tasks, or they will write tests, they will provide documentation on setup and usage, they will use static analysis tools, they will show a clear understanding of principles, and you'll do this for the different levels. So for a junior, the expectations might be lower, and for a mid, they might be reasonable, and then for a senior, they might be quite high. But again, if someone doesn't hit your expectations, it doesn't mean that they're a no. It could mean that, okay, maybe they're not a senior yet, but they might be a great developer, and they could, if they come and join us, be a senior in a year or two. And get them on board. It doesn't mean no, just because they haven't fulfilled the senior requirements. You're looking at the person rather than just the skills, and the expectations will help you. Well-defined expectations will help you make that decision. So away from like tests slightly, there's some other tips that can help. Always, like, this actually frustrates me sometimes, but like, you should always take time to research your candidate properly, right? They've gone to the effort of writing their CV and submitting their CV and going through all the hoops with the recruitment agency and various other steps that they have to go through. So take the time to research them properly, read their CV, make sure that their CV aligns for the job, right? Like, again, going back to the don't waste their time. If you haven't read their CV properly, and actually they're probably not right for the job, and then you ask them to come to an hour-long interview, you're wasting their time, right? And you're also wasting your time, but you're wasting their time. So like, read their CV and make sure they're a right fit for the job. Job specs can obviously help with that, but sometimes job specs can be a bit vague, and it can be difficult to get them right. But make sure you feel that they're right for you before you bring them to an interview, and you're only going to do that by looking at their CV properly. And then also do a bit of delving into who they are. Like, look at their GitHub profile if they have one, look at them on LinkedIn, and just get a good feel for them, right? Because that will empower you to ask better questions when they come to an interview, and you'll have a better understanding, a more holistic understanding of who they are before they come to the interview, right? This is really important in my mind, and I think this is often missed. When you're doing interviews, always ask open questions, but have a list ready of open standardized questions. Now, the difference between an open question and a closed question is quite simple. A closed question really only has a binary answer. It's going to be right or it's going to be wrong. And those sort of closed binary questions don't really tell you a lot. They don't help you. So an example of a closed question would be, name the solid principles. So, there's only there's the 5 solid principles, and they can either be right or wrong. You'll either get it that it's single responsibility, interface segregation, etc., etc. A better question you could ask, a more open question, where if you want to get an understanding of, do they understand solid, but like, you're asking like a better question, would be like, what are the benefits of single responsibility, right? And open questions are better because there's no right answer, and it gives the developer or the candidate an opportunity to express themselves properly. So don't have closed questions. And then the standardized questions part, and you don't have to have all your questions standardized. You can ask questions on the fly, but the standardized part means that if you're assessing a number of candidates and you ask a standard question or a number of standard questions to each candidate, you can do a fair comparison between the candidates. You can look at how they answered the different questions and go, well, okay, that guy or that woman, they answered that question really well. They didn't answer that question so strongly. What do we think? And you can make a standardized comparison across candidates. If you're asking completely random and different questions to each candidate, you can't really do that. You can't make a fair assessment. Whiteboarding. Okay, so we're nearly towards the end here on the advice. So whiteboarding is one I have a very mixed relationship with. I don't think you can rule out whiteboarding as an option for interviews, but I think there are a number of caveats and a number of things to think about. The first thing to remember with whiteboarding is it can be monstrously intimidating. I've been whiteboarded 4 or 5 times in my career. Sounds a bit like waterboarding, but it's not. It's obviously not as bad, but sometimes it feels pretty bad. And it's had mixed results. Sometimes the whiteboarding has gone quite well, and sometimes it's been abysmal. So my tips, if you're going to do whiteboarding, is my first one is don't ask someone to write code on a whiteboard. That's a horrible request. It's a not natural request, and I don't think it tells anyone anything about a developer's capability. So I would steer clear of doing code. Whiteboarding is better for a discussion about architecture, right? So talk about architecture. The best whiteboarding sessions I've been part of as an interview process have all been about architecture, because architecture is much more natural to talk about architecture on a whiteboard, where you start drawing out sections of an application and linking them up and saying this will do this, this will fire an event over here. That's much more natural. Writing code on a whiteboard is not natural, because no one ever writes code on a whiteboard unless they're absolutely insane, in my opinion. But keep it to architecture, and then keep it for the right candidates. Usually it's going to be a senior developer who you're going to ask to whiteboard. It's not for juniors or mid-level developers. Keep it for seniors or tech leads or things like that. Developers who are going to have some experience at doing whiteboarding or leading a whiteboarding session. And then the final point is I would always give a developer or a candidate who's going to do a whiteboarding session with me a heads up on what I'm going to ask them to talk about, right? Or to discuss. And the reason you do this is the domain warm-up idea, which sort of relates to the tests as well. Before a developer can answer a test, they have to understand the domain. They have to have some domain warm-up. And it's the same with whiteboarding. Give them an opportunity before the interview to have a bit of a think about the domain that you're going to discuss on the whiteboarding session, right? Because it's unrealistic in a job situation. In a job situation, everyone who's part of a whiteboarding session is going to have that domain warm-up or that domain knowledge. So if do this, offer the same courtesy to interview candidates. Maybe just send them a little note that says, or a bit of information that says, look, this is what we want to discuss. We're going to do a whiteboarding architectural exercise on it. Have a think about it and bring your ideas and share your ideas with us. Because that's a fairer reflection of what they'd be doing in the job. So yeah, you can do whiteboarding. I would just be careful with it, and I would handle it with, handle it delicately and make sure you're being fair on the candidate. You have some empathy for them. And finally, feedback. This is the most difficult part of the interview process, the most difficult part to get right, because it's really, really hard. Because ultimately, often you're providing feedback when you're saying no to someone. So that makes it difficult. I think the point from the earlier example that my friend received from the company is one of the key things is don't be mean. Don't be mean to people. Think about what you're saying and don't be too negative. there'll often be, the reason you're rejecting a candidate can be numerous, and it can come down to just a misunderstanding. Again, because it's not an objective process, a perfect process where you're picking good people from bad people. There will be misunderstandings, right? They might, for some reason on that day, not answered a question very well, or they may have woken up on the wrong side of bed. They may have had a bad night. So all sorts of things come together to mean that a candidate has a bad interview and doesn't do very well, and therefore you go with another candidate. So just always try and, don't be mean, don't be negative. Try to be constructive, and try to base feedback on solid ground. But yeah, it's very hard feedback. Think about it very carefully, and definitely just don't be negative, and don't dive in with pointless, like you must improve this or something like that. That doesn't help anyone. So, overview. When you're doing interviews, if you want to do better interviews, and we want to have better interviews as an industry, like, be realistic. Remember who you are as an organization. Remember what you're looking for. Like, often it won't just be the purely technical skills. It will be those many disparate and like different soft skills that are more difficult to define, like communication and empathy and ability to mentor, and will that person fit well in the existing team? All those things are really, really important. It's not just skills. Just validating skills in most cases. You're not testing them. And have empathy, right? Have empathy for the candidates. Put yourself in their position and remember what it's like to be interviewed. And remember, it can be a really intimidating and difficult process. And, if I'm sat here saying that, as someone who's been in the industry for 15 years, and in a male-dominated industry for 15 years, and I'm saying it's intimidating and difficult, well, there's plenty of other people who it will be even more intimidating for and difficult for. So have empathy for them. Don't waste their time. Remember that they've got other responsibilities. They've got their job, they've got their family, they've got all sorts of other responsibilities. So, they haven't got hours and hours and hours to waste on your technical assessments. And as I said, most of the time, people over skills. That's what you're going to be looking for. So that's my talk. It was relatively short and snappy. I'm Rob. You can see me on Twitter at Rob D. Waller. I'm on GitHub at the same place, and I've got a little website, robert.waller.info, where you can find out a bit more. So yeah, that was my talk. Thank you very much.